There's one more. By then we can catch up. Um, you to a certain extent experience On November 15th, 2013, my dad went to the local ER because he sees blood in his stool. Now, he had been experiencing quite a bit of other symptoms too before he went to the ER. He was having indigestion, a lot of heartburn. He had been losing a lot of weight, about 20 pounds. They also found that he was anemic, meaning that he was losing a lot of blood. But the blood in his stool was the final indicator that made him go to the ER because he was really scared, since his brother had died of stomach cancer, that he might be following suit. I get there and my dad says, Aki, I'm afraid that I have stomach cancer. Can you just please make it very clear that it's in my family history? And I remember talking to the GI doctor before the endoscopy, and I say, this is my dad's fear. This is why he's here. And the GI doctor went in, looked at my dad's stomach, and said, it's not stomach cancer. There was a bit of a relief. It's not stomach cancer. So my dad ended up spending the night. They run some more tests on him. He gets discharged with diverculitis, and we celebrate Thanksgiving. My dad dodged a bullet. It's not stomach cancer. Unfortunately, the biopsies came back and it was stomach cancer. He told them he's 71 years old. He is Japanese. He's a smoker, had been smoking for 50 years, and that he had a family history of gastric cancer. So here's the problem. My dad went into the hospital with every single indication, every single risk factor that this is gastric cancer, and yet it was missed. So if we're not identifying it in our high-risk population, we're going to be missing it in everybody else. Follow us, join us. We've got to do something.
The prognosis for diagnosis at my stage is, it could just be literally a few weeks.
A 5% chance of being alive in 5 years, that type of thing.
I think something like 75% of cases is diagnosed at stage 4 in the US.
It's normally so advanced before it's even discovered.
Just feeling full.
A lot of acid reflux at night.
Persistent heartburn.
Having some problems with swallowing.
Well, I started having indigestion issues, stomach issues.
I was very, very sensitive to whatever I was eating.
I was getting a lot of fluid coming back up.
Stabbing pain at the bottom of my sternum. Then I felt a bump like the end of a hot dog. Right near my belly button.
I got to the point where I could barely eat.
I was hospitalized with a stomach ulcer. I just fainted at school one day.
And all of a sudden I just started throwing up blood.
I was throwing up blood.
I was 230 pounds. By the time I actually got my official diagnosis, I was, I believe, at 160. I had to contact my doctor and he said, oh, well, it's a mild case of, gastritis. You're probably too young for any type of cancer or anything like that.
I had been having GI issues, concerns, just problems, probably for a few years. Doctors just kept chalking it up to both A, getting older, and B, just stress, maybe IBS. This area is not known for our quality healthcare.
Indigestion issues, stomach issues. He started losing a little bit of weight. It just kind of kept getting a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And I kept telling him, you should go to the doctor. But he was an independent contractor and didn't have insurance. He didn't really want to go because it meant out-of-pocket costs.
I got diagnosed after about 2 years of having persistent heartburn. You're so young, you're in your 30s, you're not overweight. Make some lifestyle changes, don't drink coffee, stay away from salt, spice. And I made all those changes and nothing helped.
I ended up vomiting what appeared to be coffee grinds, and the GI still dismissed it and said, yeah, you got a bleeding ulcer. Stood up for myself and advocated, and they actually laughed at me and said, if you think this is going to make you feel better, we'll give you an endoscopy.
I think to myself, what if I pushed for an endoscopy sooner? Would those 6 months have changed?
We had done an endoscopy a year earlier, but I have completely circumvented this experience.
It was 6 months for them to diagnose me. During that time, I was stage 3.
I think had the doctor encouraged him to take a look earlier, he might have caught it at an earlier stage.
And now I'm advocating for early screening as well, especially for high-risk groups.
I would really advocate for an aggressive approach.
Better screening, earlier screening, more doctors aware of red flags.
We should start having some sort of screening for stomach cancer, because I don't think there's screening in the United States.
My hope is that diagnostics get better to catch it earlier, because we were so lucky that our son caught it at stage 1, which is so rare.
I'm just hopeful that we can have more cancer screening younger and just more of prevention rather than treatment.
We're here because we recognize that we need a resolution to these stomach cancer disparities. We need to have definitely more research. We need to figure out why this is happening in our younger population, but we also need to start with policy change and enforcement. We need some sort of screening guidelines, and we need to be able to identify our high-risk population. And
getting a little bit worse.
And stomach cancer. And stomach cancer went from
First, I'm gonna keep telling him you should go to the doctor, but he was.
You're not overweight. Make some lifestyle changes. Don't drink coffee, skim salt, spice. And I made all those changes
to be coffee grinds, and the GI still dismissed it and said, yeah, I got a bleeding ulcer. Stood up for myself and advocated, and they actually laughed at me and said, if you think this is going to make you feel better, we'll give you an endoscopy.
I think to myself, like, what if I pushed for an endoscopy sooner? Would those 6 months have changed?
I had done an endoscopy a year earlier, and I have completely circumvented this experience.
It was 6 months for them to diagnose me. During that time, I was stage 3.
I think had the doctor encouraged him to take a look earlier, he might have caught it at an earlier stage.
And now I'm advocating for early screening as well, especially for high-risk groups.
I would really advocate for an aggressive approach.
Earlier screening, more doctors aware of red flags.
We should start having some sort of screening for stomach cancer, because I don't think there's screening in the United States.
My hope is that diagnostics get better to catch it earlier, because we were so lucky that our son caught it in stage 1, which is so rare.
I'm just hopeful that we can have more cancer screening younger and just more of prevention rather than treatment.
We're here because we recognize that we need resolution to these stomach cancer disparities. We need to have definitely more research. We need to figure out why this is happening in our younger population, but we also need to start with policy change and enforcement. We need some sort of screening guidelines, and we need to be able to identify our high-risk population and stomach cancer once and for all.
Sorry about the Wi-Fi issues and the buffering issues, but this has all been live streamed. So if you want, you can go back and look through the video without any of the buffering issues. To start us off on our Advocacy 101, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew Scott from BMS. Andrew's work focuses on hematology and oncology, and he prioritizes mutual value creation, thinking of health systems holistically, and collaborating with diverse stakeholders to advance public policy that improves patient access, affordability, and protects innovation. You could read the rest of his bio in the brochure.
Oh, this one down here. Okay. Okay, great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Andrew Scott from Bristol Myers Squibb. And while we're pulling my slides up here, I just will kind of get started with some early thoughts. Really exciting. You guys are going on your first advocacy day. I know some of you may have experience advocating on Capitol Hill before, and some of you may not. That's okay. I think hopefully this little 101 guide that I'll walk through momentarily here will give some kind of tips, tricks, and tools. But before I get into that, I really want to say, and I think that video we just watched kind of highlights that, is that it's important to remember that each of you are the experts, right? Each of you are the experts of your story, your experience, and your kind of a critical voice going into these Hill meetings that you will have tomorrow. So it's important to kind of remind yourselves of that. You know, it's going to be, I know it can be a little, I used to actually work at I'm with obviously Bristol Myers Squibb now, but used to work at an advocacy organization focused on liver cancer. And I know many of our advocates were worried, you know, it's a little jitters, first time doing it. But again, remind yourselves, this is your story. This is your time to tell it. And they will listen when you go into those Hill meetings. So I really want to kind of reiterate that throughout this presentation as we're waiting for these slides to come up. And really a lot of this stuff that I'll go through momentarily here, we'll do a little government 101 as well. We'll also kind of talk about how to establish your messaging plan and kind of building all of that out. And hopefully we can get them to work here, these slides. But we'll talk a little bit about how to establish your kind of plan so that you feel organized. Obviously, as these meetings go, you'll get more comfortable as you go. So you'll get kind of your elevator pitch down. You'll come out of your first advocacy day feeling like a pro, which will help a ton as well. And then we'll close with kind of do's and don'ts of this kind of advocacy day. There's certain things that, obviously, if you kind of follow the guide, it'll just make it easier and make it even more comfortable for you. So if we can go to perfect. Okay. So I want to be cognizant of time too, but I also want to say that if you have a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Obviously, there'll be an opportunity to ask maybe some questions at the end as well. But I'm always happy to pause. I really want to make this a fun experience here. You're going to be talking about your lived experiences, and it's going to be shaping policy. And that, I think, is an exciting process here. Your voice matters, as I mentioned earlier. So as I already kind of alluded to, we're going to be talking a little bit about that kind of government 101 to start. We'll then get into kind of developing your plan, your advocacy plan, mapping things out. So I mentioned kind of talking through things, working with each other will help as well, because then you're going to go into these meetings and you're going to kind of have a plan of attack that will really make this as fun and easy of a process at all. And then we'll finally get into the do's and don'ts of advocacy. So I'll also mention too that I'm going to hit a lot of stuff that's kind of broader than just your Hill Day tomorrow. I think an important theme as well is that advocacy, policy work, all of that takes time. It takes your initial meeting, your initial sharing of your story. Then it's going to take follow-up. It's going to take kind of pinging those legislative staffers and more tomorrow, reminding them of your ask, whether it's the screening ask or whatever it might be. It's going to require that follow-up. And then eventually you'll see some movement, and it's still going to take time. So I think that's an important thing that I'll walk through briefly as well when I'm talking about other ways to advocate outside of being here in Washington, D.C., which there are a lot of ways to do it. So first, we're going to kind of talk about just general government 101, advocacy 101 to start us off here. Advocacy definition. I won't go through all of these details here, but really, I just want to say that many of you have advocated before, whether you've come here to Washington and advocated in a policy sense, or you've advocated in your community, or you've advocated in your family for whatever it might be, changing, moving the day of a family get together or whatever it might be. You already have experience advocating, building, kind of establishing in your mind a messaging plan, what you are hoping to achieve, and then having that ask, right? You've done all this before. Now we're just doing it in a new setting here on Capitol Hill. So there are the three types of kind of government advocacy as well. Of course, you have your local and community advocacy, your state advocacy, and your federal advocacy that you all will be doing tomorrow. I think it's also important to understand too, when I'm talking about time, you're going to see movement kind of decrease as you go to federal government as well too. I think that's an important factor to keep in mind. Local is where you will see some change quicker. And I think that's also important to keep in mind too, is that it's part of this advocacy is don't hold yourself only to Capitol Hill. I mean, it's a huge part of it, right? The federal government is critical in some of these system level changes, but it is not the only option when you're talking about, I'm just brainstorming here, but an awareness day for stomach cancer or whatever it might be, you can get that in your own city, your own, whatever it might be at the local level, in your city hall, town hall. There are opportunities there as well. So very briefly, again, I won't go through all of this. I'm happy to share the slides, but being cognizant of time, this is really kind of your legislative process. If any of you watched that old video of how a bill becomes a law, this kind of walks through that very briefly there. And it shows that just kind of the process of having a sponsor of a bill, then the bill is assigned to a committee, the committee holds a hearing on the bill, and then it's put on the Senate or House calendar. And then it's kind of goes through the process again so that you can have it move through both chambers of the House and Senate. And then you eventually get to a full floor vote. So it's a series of processes. This is one of the reasons why it takes so long. But again, I'm happy to share this later. But just kind of moving through some of this government 101 quickly. And then also outside of the federal legislative process, there is the regulatory advocacy as well too. So some of Aki's asks that she mentioned in that video have more of a regulatory advocacy piece to it as well. And this is when you're working with agencies like the FDA or the CDC or whoever it might be to get an awareness campaign or screening guidelines changed. This is where the regulatory advocacy piece comes into play. Obviously, I'm going to move through this quickly because tomorrow you're focused on Capitol Hill. So now I'm going to shift a little bit in that kind of developing of the messaging plan. I've talked about that a few times already, but it's going to be important. Obviously, you are the ones who know your story better than anyone else, but still having a plan of attack before you go into these meetings, kind of a order that you're going to go through, potentially communicating with any teams that you're on about who's going to speak when. Maybe they are from a certain legislative district or whatever it might be. Kind of organizing yourselves in a way will make this a lot smoother because you will be restricted by time tomorrow. That is something that always happens, is that you will have a limited amount of minutes with most likely legislative staff. Hopefully you'll have time with the member of Congress. I'll mention this again later as well, but legislative staff are sometimes more important to meet with than the member of Congress because they're the ones who write the bill. So they are important to meet with, but they will be limited and they will give you, the time, but at the same time, you want to be organized so that you can actually get to your ask. You don't want to walk out of the meeting thinking, oh, I didn't get a chance to actually tell them what we want. You want them to know that. So that's where this really comes into play here, is planning your advocacy effort, really thinking of what is your primary goal as a start, coming together as a group and understanding this is our ask. Who is the target audience? In this case, it will be legislative staff, members of Congress on Capitol Hill tomorrow. And then, I will talk a little bit more of the best way to reach them. Of course, meeting them in person tomorrow or by Zoom is a great way to do that. And then, of course, also, I mentioned earlier the follow-up plan as well, because this was going to take time. This one meeting tomorrow is not going to see your goal accomplished. So it's important to think again about how you can follow up. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then also thinking of how you can collaborate, thinking of your allies here in this room, your allies in other advocacy organizations. It takes a village to move the needle on some of these bills, and it's important to have allies with you. So when we're talking about developing your message, and this is really what I was talking about earlier, is how you kind of organize yourself to make sure you go into these meetings tomorrow feeling prepared. And you're doing your research on the member that you're meeting with, the staff. I think this way it's a great way to uncover little tidbits. Potentially you might, have gone to the same high school as the member of Congress or whatever it might be. It's a great way to kind of break the ice before you get into your story and what you're actually there to talk about today. Or you can talk about how, I went to a hospital in your district and I know that you've been there as well, or whatever it might be. Can be a great way to start by doing your research and ensuring that you're prepared before you go into the meeting. And then organizing your thoughts. This is what I was talking about earlier, is that the story is a critical part of this meeting tomorrow, but you want to ensure that you kind of have that elevator pitch down. You're going to be limited in time, so you want to kind of organize your thoughts, map it out. I would write it down the night before, potentially even write down your story too. Because again, you're going to think you're going to have a few minutes. And I'm sure all of you have wonderful stories that take longer than a few minutes to share, but you want to, again, ensure that you get to that ask, right? So you want to ensure that you kind of move through things in an organized fashion. If more than one of you are going to talk, kind of ensuring that you're organized and that you're kind of both dividing and conquering. Maybe one person gets one meeting, another person gets another, or one person kind of starts things off, one person tells their story this time, and another person has the ask. So all of that, and you kind of see here, I give some examples of, how you kind of organize your thoughts, maybe little kind of hooks to kind of get yourself rolling as you map out your plan. And then, of course, telling your story, the most important part of this, that will resonate with these legislators. It will. Your story is powerful. And it is the one thing that is going to, I will say a brief story about an example of advocate I worked with in the past in my former organization. He told a story about how his story of being impacted by liver cancer. And the member of Congress that we were meeting with immediately decided that he was signing on the bill right after hearing that story. And our advocate, was very nervous going into that. He had never done this before. And he's like, oh, the federal government, they're not going to listen to me. They don't care about my story. But after that, right, I mean, his confidence was through the roof. And I want to caution that too. You're not always going to get a legislator to walk out signing onto a bill, but it gives an example of the possibilities, right? And we kind of organize things in a way. You're not trying to cut your story short, but you want to just be aware of the time and aware of those kind of key inflection points that might resonate. Doing your research again, so you know maybe ahead of time what might resonate with the office. And of course, ending by making the ask. And then there are, I mentioned earlier how there will be many forums. You guys will be doing the live portion mostly tomorrow. There are, of course, virtual options as well. And this is what I'm talking about, how when you think about how this is going to take time, and it's going to take consistent meetings, your first meeting tomorrow is not going to lead to that. I mean, I gave that one example that, was in a perfect situation, but it's not going to always lead to that, right? And that's where you have to think of these others. You're going to want to call the district office potentially. You're going to want to build a relationship. That's why I mentioned earlier doing the research, thinking of those connections, right? Your story will resonate, but there will be other things that connect with these legislative staffs, their members, that will allow you to stick in their memory, right? Because they will be meeting with a lot of people in a day. They go through, many of these staffers, they are covering multiple issue areas. So they're not only health, they're not only meeting with many different health advocacy organizations, they're also meeting with tax, they're meeting with energy, they're meeting with a wide range. So you got to think about what is going to cause your story to stick out in their mind. And then you're going to want to have these other examples of advocacy that you can kind of keep reminding them that you're here. And then there are the virtual options as well, social media, calling out there, doing an op-ed, press releases, and more, or other ways, that emailing them, reminding them, and more. So, I want to be cognizant of time here. I'm going to move quickly through. I've kind of talked broadly about a lot of this already. When you're thinking of a good meeting, I kind of gave a story as an example already, but really it's kind of mapping out your plan, having your goal, organizing who's saying what when, being sure that you're confident in how you tell your story in a short way, and then kind of moving through until you get to the eventual ask as well. And then, of course, ending the meeting, and I'll talk about this at the end as well, about the do's and don'ts of actual meetings, and that is thanking them for their time. And then a key part at the end here I'll just flag is the business cards, that you can continue doing some of those advocacy options that I flagged earlier. And then, again, since tomorrow is focused on the Hill Day, I'm going to kind of move through this. I'm happy to share these slides. These are some social media tips of how to potentially continue that kind of drumbeat of advocacy. So now we're going to get to the do's and don'ts. And this is really kind of an important thing to keep in mind tomorrow is when you get in there, we've mapped out the plan, you've got your ask, you've got your goal, you've practiced your story, but now it's just the small things that will ensure that these meetings go well. It's, things that you might be, of course, I got to introduce myself. Well, there's been situations where naturally people forget, or you forget to shake their hands, or you forget to do you go off topic. As another example. I mean, you feel like you're flowing, but suddenly your 15 minutes are up and you've gone off topic. So it's important to keep that in mind too. Of course, ending with the ask. I've mentioned that a few times. Telling your story, being respectful is important. I think this, and I may mention this again later as well, but it's important that this, of course, politics are involved in all of this. And I know everyone is from all across the United States, but it's important to kind of keep the politics outside of these meetings, right? We're talking policy, not politics. We're talking healthcare, health policy, but keeping the politics separate. So I think, being respectful, understanding that you're going to be meeting with both sides of the aisle tomorrow. You're going to need both sides of the aisle to accomplish your goal, right? I think in a normal, I will say, I won't get into the details of today's Congress, but in a normal Congress, both sides working together are going to accomplish things. And then some of the don'ts, I kind of talked about these already as well, but covering multiple topics, you want to stay focused on your ask. Again, thinking about the politics and policy, you don't want to argue with these members and their staff tomorrow. Again, when you're organizing yourself, just making sure, you're going to naturally miss some points. That happens. You'll get comfortable and you'll have your elevator pitch, but you want to make sure you hit at least the big points you're trying to hit. And then the follow-up is just so critical as well. So, with that, I'm going to kind of bring it, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might has, but, we talked a little bit of the kind of government 101, establishing your plan, making sure you're organized, thinking of your story, mapping that out, talking tonight, figuring out who you're going to be in the room with, and then figuring out how you're going to organize yourselves in each of those meetings. And then we close with a little bit of the do's and don'ts of these actual Hill meetings as well. But also, again, another reminder, the follow-up is going to be key. So you're going to go into these meetings, you're going to ask for the business card, you're going to take it home, you're going to email them potentially as well, too, if you feel comfortable with it. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But again, to see the actual things, these, ask actually move, it's important to kind of keep that press in a respectful way. So any questions? I'm happy to answer any. Yes.
So are the meetings, you're saying kind of the meetings are probably like 15 minutes?
I would plan on 15 minutes. And I would also plan that these meetings could be standing in the hallway. They could be in the office and you have a nice couch to sit on and you're comfortable, or they could be walking, so it's important, again, to have that plan early,
How often are the legislators late? Like if they're not there when we think the meeting is, do we for a couple hours?
The meetings will happen when they happen. The staff will meet with you then. Unless it will, if the legislator can't be there, they can't be there. Sometime, and that will happen. The staff will say, so-and-so member of Congress got pulled into votes or whatever it might be. So they will let you know. And then you might get lucky. You might be meeting in their, entry room, and then the member comes in and they're like, oh, and you can briefly say hi and, and shake their hand and then, continue your ask with the staff. But yeah, if the meeting's happening, it's happening at the time that they, maybe 15 minutes, but that's, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah. Oh, no, so I will say there are a lot of ways. This was just showing all the different ways to advocate. You do not need videos. You do not need pictures. I will say, it can help, but it's purely up to you and your story. I will say I, did a meeting with another advocate that was talking about heart disease, and they had a plastic heart to talk about it. So there are but don't feel obligated to do that. There just tell your story, and be confident in that, and you'll be fine. You'll be all good. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so now the question, are we going to get to what our ask is?
Yeah, what are these talking points?
I think Aki has them, so I also, yes, we're going through them later. Yes.
Also, logistics question.
Yes.
Once we're in the Capitol, are we inside and go to these buildings underground, or are we going to have to go above ground and go to multiple buildings?
So you can go underground. And I will say, as a quick preface, it's a maze. You're going to get lost, so you want to make sure you have time. If you can get there early, you want to. You can go underground, you can go above ground. If you go above ground, you'll have to go through security in each building. The security is much faster than it would be at an airport or anything like that. So it's generally quick. But if you go down to the basement level, And don't hesitate. There are no dumb questions. You can always ask people too, and they'll point you in the right direction. But if you can map that out ahead of time, and maybe you'll be getting into that a little later.
7:30 when we go over the full prepping for next tomorrow.
Yes.
Are we going as groups into talking to some of these legislators?
We'll talk about that at 7:30.
Yes, I'm giving just the help for planning out your plan of attack. You guys will get those details later. Yes, one more question. I know I'm over time too, but one more question on the way back. Yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, congressperson, representative, if you're unsure, so that's, and then the staff, you can just call them by their first name. They'll introduce you. Go ahead. Yep.
One time, the actual citizen so most of the time,
I'm sorry, I'm over time.
We're talking about this at 7:30. I'm sorry, we just have to get to our next presentation. And Cindy, you're actually leading our 7:30 discussion. So you are going to be able to answer all those questions that we all have.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And we are happy to share these slides too later. Yep.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, I'd like to call up Chul Hyun. He has a celebrated CV, MD, PhD, a master's in public health. I'm going to run through the bio because I know we're over time already, but he has founded several nonprofit organizations, such as the Center for Viral Hepatitis and Asian American Stomach Cancer Task Force, and has published articles on ethnic health disparities and is currently the chair of the New York Health Forum. Dr. Hyun.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Chul Hyun. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. This is really great to see you all here this evening. I'm a gastroenterologist, and I practice, GI and hepatology in New York and New Jersey area. It's really great to be here and a part of this conference. First of all, I want to congratulate Aki and all the members of Hope Stomach Cancer for doing an amazing job in empowering and advocating for the gastric cancer patients. I think your work is crucial because it gives patients not only the ownership, but also the power to navigate the many difficult problems that there may be in the future. As a physician, I think empowering patients is actually one of our duties. The way that I try to empower my patient is trying to actively listening to their problems and their questions. I've been in practice over almost 30 years, but I must admit that I still on and off fail to listen to my patients. And I do see a lot of patients who come to me and complain that that their doctors don't listen to their patients. And in fact, today's electronic medical record system doesn't really help the matter because the patients will come and say, "Listen, in 15 minutes of sitting in the office, the guy has just looked at me maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and he or she was busy, watching the monitor." I mean, they're working on the computer monitor. So it's very difficult, and it's not as easy as it sounds. What I mean by listening is kind of like active listening, which really goes beyond just hearing the words, but trying to understand the meanings and the feelings behind all those words, and also you have to understand the context as well, with all this, what a patient's trying to say with their words and also their gestures. So this is a very challenging, very difficult job. But if there is active listening, it's the job is half done because it not only establishes a certain empathy and rapport or some sort of like a faith with patients, but it can also help the patients to, the power to allow them to navigate their healthcare issues. So I think this is a win-win situation actually for both patients and the physicians. I think we all have to remember that all the clinical decision making is on behalf of the patients, not the healthcare providers. On a personal note, it's really great to be here in Arlington because I used to live here in this area, not too far actually from here, maybe about a half mile from here. And many years ago, I did my residency in Georgetown in internal medicine. Just ran into an old friend of mine, John Marshall. I think John was the first year, I guess, when I was a senior resident. So, but I haven't seen him for many years. So this is was a very nice reunion actually, and it's. So being here in Arlington actually brings back many old memories, and one of which I'd like to share. It was back in 1986. I was doing my internship, and it must have been about 2 weeks before Christmas. I got a call from my parents who were living in Miami, Florida back then. And so my mom was saying that, hey, your dad has passed some black melanic stool, which is Him positive, and he's been complaining of some epigastric discomfort, which has been progressing and recently. And so obviously he flew to DC next day and underwent gastroscopy. And I still vividly remember seeing a small ulcer sitting in the antrum of stomach, which had a stigmata of recent bleed. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but it was like a small ulcer. The biopsy, which came back next day, signet ring cell adenocarcinoma. So he did have a stomach cancer. Well, he was lucky because his presentation was a very noticeable black stool, and nobody can really, dismiss that. And it was something that was very striking, and then he began to relate to his symptom in epigastrium, because most of the time, many of you, I'm sure, we all do have on and off epigastric discomfort, right? And we will dismiss it as a reflux disease, and you go see your doctors, and they will probably treat you with PPIs. Back then, actually, the H2 antagonist, and we still use them actually. But so he was lucky, because I don't think he would have called me unless he had a black stool. So he had a very lucky presentation, and turned out to be an early cancer. I think the stomach cancer in the U.S. is a serious health issue. If we combine all the stages, you probably know about this, the survival rate for stomach cancer in this country is dismally low at 33%, as compared to 72% in Korea, by the way, and 65% in Japan. So we're really behind, all right, with respect to gastric cancer. And I think in this aspect, we are really more like a third world developing country. That's where we are. The instance of stomach cancer varies between different ethnicities. You all know that. And recent studies have demonstrated that for people above age 50, the instance of stomach cancer can be 3 to 14 times higher in certain ethnic populations, such as Asian and Latin American populations, as compared to non-Hispanic whites. So in addition to the disparities in incidence and the mortality rates of stomach cancer, there is a serious and market a funding disparity in stomach cancer. So if you look at the funding situations from, for example, NCI, and looking at the past 15-year records, we find that the which cancer do you think got the most funding? Breast cancer, right? You're right. Breast cancer got 550 million the annual funding, an average, whereas the stomach cancer got 13 million dollars. So, well, I mean, you really can compare. They're not really apple to apple, right? So, the breast cancer is 10 times more common than gastric cancer in this country. So if we look at the disparities of the funding, we have to analyze it using one of the tools that we use to analyze the disparity is what we call the funding to lethality score. That is the ratio of funding, how much money is being funded for specific specific cancer over the lethality, whereas the lethality is defined as mortality incidence ratio multiplied by a person's years of life lost. So, if you compare the funding to lethality score of breast cancer, it comes out to be like 180. Whereas if you look at the gastric cancer FDL score, it's 1.8. There's a 100-fold difference in the funding between these two cancers. Not only that, if you look at the funding, there's a pattern here that the cancers that are more prevalent among non-Hispanic whites get funded more, such as not only breast cancer, but leukemia and lymphoma, whereas the cancers that are less prevalent in non-Hispanic whites and more prevalent in the minority populations, such cancers such as uterine cancer, stomach cancer, liver cancers, the funding is very low. So these, the NCI funding disparities, I mean, it has to be addressed, and there has to be something that needs to be done about this. So these are the reasons actually why we created the stomach cancer task force. Our headquarters is based in New Jersey. And we have a great network of physicians in the community. We basically have a mission to bring together the community and the physicians and the policymakers to find an innovative approach to have this to spread this, increase this awareness about the stomach cancer and this disparities. And we have two specific goals. One is to not only to increase the awareness about the stomach cancer in disparities, but we also want to be able to develop a screening guideline for the population at high risk. So these are our missions. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we have a forum. We have a flyer out there on the desk outside. Please don't forget to pick one. And we do have about 2-hour lasting forum. It's going to be during the lunch time from 12 to 2. I know you will be busy moving around from office to office, but it's a lunchtime anyway. So please stop by and grab a bite and listen to our speakers. Actually, John's going to speak in our forum again, but we'll have several other speakers. Your own Mahathi and Aki are going to speak as well. So I would love to see you in our forum tomorrow. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address and answer any questions. Yeah.
So developing screening guidelines, so we're speaking, you want to speak with the Congress people tomorrow? Is that one of the goals?
Yes, yeah. Eventually, I think the ideal thing would be to have Congress create a caucus on stomach cancer, through which they can, eventually develop a screening guideline, at least for the high-risk populations. The studies are out there, by the way, that have shown the cost effectiveness of gastric cancer screening by endoscopy, gastroscopy, in high-risk populations. There are plenty of data out there, and the data is very strong, and it's about time the government has to do something about it. One more question. I know we have a few more minutes. Yes.
So are you saying, okay, for example, with colon cancer, people tend to get colonoscopies, what, at age 50 and
45, yeah.
or 45? Oh, sorry. That's okay. Thank you. So would having some sort of encouragement for people to get endoscopies at a certain age, would that be the way to catch the stomach cancer?
Yes, exactly, exactly. If you look at the studies from, for example, from Japan and Korea, there's several studies in Japan where they have looked at the people 50 to 75 and biannual gastric cancer screening with either upper GI or gastroscopy. It was very cost effective. There's a big study from Korea from age 40 on. If you look at them, it is a biannual gastric cancer screening by gastroscopy was very cost effective. It saves a lot of lives. In fact, 25 years ago, the survival rate of gastric cancer in Korea was about 35%. And 20 years, it increased to 70%.
Is that what they're doing? Is that what's making the difference in Korea and Japan?
We think so. We think so. We think this is what's making difference in Korea.
That's incredible.
Yep, it is incredible. Yeah. And yep. Any questions? Thank you. Yeah, okay, sure, please.
So you said tomorrow the gastric cancer task force luncheon is from 12 to 2.
12 to 2, yeah.
Okay, because in our program it's 11.
Right.
Right.
So-
We're joining for the program and the lunch, correct?
Yeah,
And then-
we're providing lunch, and so we want you to come, stop by, and have lunch and attend our forum. We will have a few congressmen come speak, and we'll have Dr. Marshall speaking, and we'll have another gastroenterologist from town, actually, Dr. Hong, who will speak on the screening and diagnosis of gastric cancer. We will have Aki and Mahathi speak also, and we'll have a good Q&A session afterwards.
But if you have 2 p.m. meetings or so, obviously the meetings will then come and you'll have to leave early. Yes.
So we'll look forward to meeting you tomorrow again. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hyun. I'm Mahathi, by the way, for those who don't know, so I'll be speaking tomorrow, and I'm really short. Anyways, before I call up our next speaker, I just want to point out we have Neville here from Advocacy Day. He's the one who set up all of your meetings tomorrow. I think he's staying through dinner. So if you have any specific questions about your app, if you haven't downloaded the app yet, if you don't know how to access it, I would say go talk to him. He would be the person to answer all your questions. We're training late on after dinner around 7:30. So just hang tight and we'll go over the whole agenda for tomorrow. Okay, so next I'd like to call up our next speaker, Dr. Asad Umar. Dr. Umar is the Chief Program Officer of the Gastrointestinal and Other Cancers Department, and he completed his PhD in biochemistry at Hopkins. So Dr. Umar.
Thank you. First, thank you, Aki Smith and the rest of the organizing team to give me this time to talk to you guys about the advancing gastric cancer prevention as an overview from NCI. As you heard Dr. Rathmel earlier, I'm in the Division of Cancer Prevention at NCI that focuses on early detection and prevention, as well as screening of cancers. Lead the GI cancers program. However, gastric, as Dr. Hyun said, the funding for gastric cancer is really low. And that's because of the rare disease or the number of cancers, as well as I think there's also really the research community have to submit um, proposals that have really good research ideas to really take it forward, as well as like screening proposals. Um, absolutely true that in Korea and Japan, the mortality rates are way better than in the US, and screening makes the difference. It's the early detection and screening. I think it's going to be really difficult to really do a population-based screening in the U.S. because of the numbers of gastric cancer, total numbers that are for gastric cancer. But I'm hopeful that actually with the new blood-based um, multi-cancer early detection tests or cancer tests that have gastric cancers also included in those, there will be actually still there's a cost issue with those, as well as their accuracy and all that. But I think we will overcome those issues, and we'll get to that point. Um, we were actually at NCI, we're very fortunate to get funding, a bolus of funding from Biden moonshot money to actually start a set of screening trials where we are actually going to compare a number of these blood-based tests, the multi-cancer early detection tests, to actually if they are as good as they are reporting, because many of them are, actually all of them, the companies all propose that they are really good in actually detecting early or shifting the stages. We at NCI, we want to really look at head-to-head comparison of multiple tests. Which one is the best test? Which one gives you the best opportunity to really have fewest false negatives and false positives as well. So let's see how this moves. So a view of gastric as well as overall carcinogenesis. In the division of cancer prevention where I am, we're focused on cancer prevention, early detection, and we see that the cancer as a really you can target in the red zone where after cancer is the treatment setting, and that's the where you can have survival with cancer. What we want to focus on really is the cancer prevention, which is the blue triangle area. That's actually a larger area, and you can have multiple points in there where you can target and actually survival without cancer. And really the precancerous lesions, finding those early, and these blood-based tests maybe that we will actually get to that. I think I'm going in the wrong direction. Let's see. So cancer progression from normal to advanced invasive cancer takes really a long time, and it's like decades. So from normal to initiated to mild dysplasia, then severe dysplasia and carcinoma in situ, and then finally invasive cancer, it really gives a lot of opportunities to identify these lesions in between, as well as actually target them for intervention, actually do some prevention there as well. So we have done in some cancers have been much more successful where we have like prophylactic, like vaccines, for example, HPV, where we have a vaccine. H. pylori vaccine project was actually at one point was started. Many companies were funding it, but then it was dropped because really there's not a whole lot of money in for the pharmaceutical companies for making a vaccine for these, because gastric cancer actually is a huge problem worldwide. It's not a big problem in the US where the money is. So that's where really the problem is. So we try to focus a lot on interception, but maybe precision screening where a screening based on individuals' risk, and those risk factors, not only just racial, ethnic, but also family history, could also make a difference, as well as now we have genetic information as well. That can also make a difference. I think these numbers we all know. Incidence of stomach cancer is both by incidence is almost 1 million cases in 2022. It's the number 5th is most common cancer. Mortality is really high, almost 700,000 of those million in 2022. The risk factors are, I mean, we all know in this room, H. pylori, EBV was more recently identified when they did the genomic analysis, smoking, as well as some genetic polymorphism in some of the genes for alcohol, for example, the alcohol dehydrogenase polymorphism has this evidence. Food preserved with salt probably is is more of a proxy for H. pylori because where refrigeration is not there in those countries where people really preserve food with salt, and that really is actually the proxy for H. pylori in that sense. Obesity leads to inflammation, IL-6, TNF-alpha, C-reactive protein, and insulin that all make some difference. There is some evidence, not that strong, for processed meat or grilled or charred meat for many of the GI cancers. The cancer prevention, the epidemiology, as mentioned earlier, is highest in Japan and Korea and South America, as well as Eastern Europe. Adjusted rates worldwide are 15.62 per 100,000. Latin America is variable rates. It has been going down. Gastric cancer in the US, incidence has been decreasing. However, this is for overall population, but more recently in last couple of decades, in younger individuals, the gastric cancer is actually going up. So we don't really understand what's going on in terms of not only just the gastric cancer, but actually multiple other cancers. Colorectal cancer, breast cancer is also going up in younger population. Under 40, when you say younger, it used to be under 50, but now 45, as we mentioned just a little while ago, for even colonoscopy was dropped to 45 age because of that increase in now 45 is the new 50. That's where we are getting there. So prevention of gastric cancer, reducing exposure to these risk factors is really is the key that I mentioned. But actually, really secondary prevention with early detection and screening is going to make a difference. So we can't really necessarily control some of the exposure to environmental factors that we have, but screening and early detection that we can make a difference. And then tertiary prevention by treating H. pylori EBV, vaccine strategies. H. pylori can be eradicated with antibiotics, or also treating precancers to reverse the course of disease. If we can do the screening and identify these intermediate lesions, we can target that and reduce the actually cancer incidence. But we're not there. So I already talked about that. So there's strong data for H. pylori eradication. Number of studies. So each line here is a separate study that's showing H. pylori eradication with antibiotic treatment actually reduce. One is the line where if it's on the left side of one, the circle in the middle is the average relative risk. So generally, H. pylori eradication has the biggest benefit. Also, other cancer prevention strategies like anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin, is showing really a dose-dependent manner. So if you look at aspirin frequency, occasionally the relative risk is 0.96. If it is number of times is 30 plus, per month, that means daily, is 0.74. That means it's a 25%, 26% reduction in just by aspirin if taken daily. However, aspirin can also cause bleeding, so have to be careful in terms of use of that. There are other non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like COX-2 inhibitors also show 0.46 relative risk, much stronger benefit. These other NSAIDs also show the same pattern, so it seems like it is a real effect. And we are doing actually a number of clinical trials and looking at different cancers for NSAIDs and cancer preventive activity because they are relatively safe. There are some side effects that you have to be aware of and not take these without consultation with your doctor. The trials we are doing for cancer prevention in our at the NCI funded trials, one of them is looking at Mariva, which is a curcumin, curry, the yellow color, curcumin is the coloring in the curry. Mariva is a nanoparticle formulation of that curcumin. Curcumin has been shown to be an anti-inflammatory, and it is really pretty safe. But we have done actually a number of clinical trials with curcumin alone, have not seen any clinical benefit for colon cancer or other cancers where in animal studies they show benefit. So in humans, they didn't show benefit. We have some interest in looking at this liposome nanoparticle because it seems to give more blood concentration of curcumin, so it's get absorbed better. So it's a company research is actually, I think it's available. We get that from, and doing this in Puerto Rico and Honduras, where much higher rate of gastric cancer. So we have actually fully recruited this study, 60 participants. These are small studies, but they are proof of concepts. If they show us positive signal, we can launch larger studies with the NCI community oncology program, and the cooperative groups can do further studies. Another study, very similar design, we are also working with, again, in Honduras and Puerto Rico, where there's a larger number of gastric cancer patients, is looking at difluoromethyl-ornithine, or DFMO. Difluoromethyl-ornithine is actually was originally a chemotherapy candidate drug for treatment of cancers. It targets one of the enzymes that is important for cell proliferation, polyamine ornithine decarboxylase. It reduces the polyamines, and ornithine decarboxylase is important. However, it didn't really pan out for treatment. Its side effect is a reversible hearing loss of certain frequencies, but it reverses after you stop taking it. It still is a drug for sleeping sickness, schistosomiasis in African countries. So that's actually made by pharmaceutical companies for those purposes. So it is available in our repository as for cancer preventive, and we see actually very strong signal for colorectal cancer. So we're looking at actually based on animal data that DFMO has an effect on H. pylori as well as in the gastric intestinal metaplasia to reducing that metaplasia. Again, if this is going to pan out in humans, we will find out actually pretty soon. That trial is complete, but we don't have the results from that. We also just recently funded, as a push on our part from my group for funding more gastric cancer research, a precision cancer prevention program for gastric cancer. The project is a multi-year project where they're going to look at genomics in individuals, their genomics in the stem cells of stomach, for individuals where there's a resistant clones after treatment of H. pylori. The H. pylori comes back, so they are going to actually target those individuals that are resistant to that H. pylori eradication with, again, specified interventions, that trial will be designed based on the genomic information. So that's actually is a big program project grant that's close to over 20 million over 5 years will be funded for that. So that's actually more than doubles the GI gastric funding in our program in that sense. There's also an ongoing EBV vaccine at the NCI, and as well as others are also developing it. But I think actually immuno prevention approaches or vaccine approaches, really NCI have to do it themselves, because companies are not going to do these, because there's not much profit for them in that sense. So I think that's the end of my slides, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
You quoted quite a few statistics, but one that I didn't hear or I missed was, do you know what percentage of the gastric cancer patients in the U.S. are from ethnic communities or
exact number, majority of cancer patients are from Hispanic background. I mean, that's why we are going actually in Puerto Rico to do the trial with the gastric cancer prevention, because we can't really find enough patients in other places. So you need to have, I mean, also in Latin American countries where there's much higher incidence, you can get those patients. So Latin American countries is where we're going, and the Latina population in the US have a higher numbers as well, but I don't know exact numbers, what they are. Yes, in the back.
Of people that have had H. pylori that becomes malignant into gastric cancer, I've read anywhere from 3% to 90%.
Yeah.
What is your estimate?
Yeah, so it is actually very, it varies, and H. pylori is one of the microbiota, or one of the organisms that evolved with humans. And the study that were done for H. pylori in Panama and in some of these countries, so there's like a altitude enigma, where all the people have actually the same number of same percentage of H. pylori positive, but the people that live on the coast actually have a higher gastric cancer than the people that live on the mountains. And it was an enigma, and until they actually sequenced those H. pylori, so they are either from like itself, differences. I don't know if it really works. That I've seen in the research they have done, really videography with the fluorescence, that actually you can see H. pylori going into the cell and coming back out and go and hides there when there's a treatment is given, antibiotic treatment. So it's really fascinating, but we still fully don't really understand the differences.
I've
So,
heard
yeah.
that H. pylori can actually hide
Yeah.
in the gastric lining, especially, I mean, with endoscopy, it doesn't always, because there's not a lesion, it might be hiding. Is
Right.
that true?
Yes. So the strongest data that I've seen is with the last bullet on my final slide was that precision cancer prevention, where they actually have treated the patient, and before treating, they sequence the H. pylori. When they after treatment, H. pylori treatment. The H. pylori was gone, but it came back again. When they sequenced second time, it was exact same sequence. So it wasn't really even a different H. pylori. So it was hiding somewhere, and then back. So exactly that. Yeah.
And a colonoscopy. And in the endoscopy, they did find that I had gastritis and H. pylori. So my husband had to get tested. My kids had to get tested. We all tested positive. We went through the treatment. My husband, my oldest daughter, and I tested negative after the treatment, and my youngest tested positive again. So she just finished the second round of antibiotics. So I'm still waiting 2 more weeks because I have to wait a month to retest her. But through that time, now I'm afraid that we all got it again because we're still in the same household.
Yeah, so that's the very common theme happens throughout for everyone. So that's what the last these researchers they are trying to do is actually target treatment for H. pylori based on once they find that it's not going away, maybe there's another drug is needed there. So just add something else based on the sequence of H. pylori. So it will be targeted for each individual in that sense.
So, is this on? Yeah. So I have a question because of H. pylori. My daughter, who does not have gastric cancer, has H. pylori, but my daughter, who has gastric cancer, we don't know if she had H. pylori because she was just diagnosed with cancer. But my daughter is cured, quote unquote, from H. pylori. But now I'm wondering, like, is there some protocol? I mean, should she be tested regularly? I mean, this has me concerned. And they're not related biologically. They're adopted from Russia, Eastern European, and Asian. Yeah.
Yeah, there is no program, but I mean that's something is going to this research that I was mentioning is going to lead to that maybe we need to come up with some strategy for that. But I mean, the H. pylori is very common in the world. Less common in the U.S., but it is very common in Eastern European countries, in Asian countries, Latin America. It's very common. Not everyone get cancer, also, so it's not necessarily. But again, is connected with this. It is a class 1 carcinogen by WHO.
Do you usually get it as a child? Because my mom just had H. pylori. My dad has gastric cancer, and when they did his endoscopy, he tested negative, but my mom tested positive for H. pylori. So I guess I have 2 different questions. So is it possible that he had it and at one point?
Yes. So usually people get that in their childhood, and it's like really decades. I mean, again, maybe nothing happens to majority of the people, but some individuals do get like pathology with that, the gastric intestinal metaplasia, and then further, that's what leads to it next steps. But we don't really know what is there another hit or something else is needed for that? We don't know that.
So is it possible that my dad had it and because he tested negative for it when he got diagnosed, but was it possible that he did have it without?
Hard to tell. But usually within the family, it stays within the family. And I mean, often either it's just it's hiding, but again, if it's not hiding, people just get like fully treated. In many of these countries we've done in Latin America, it will be the same strain that will come back when you sequence those H. pylori. They are the same one that just suggests either it was hiding or just like got again from the same family environment. You're getting it again, exactly the same one.
And because my parents live with me and I tested negative, should my children get tested for it?
Probably.
They should.
Yeah.
Is the breath test sufficient?
I'm not so sure about these tests. Actually, what is the best test? So that would be somebody else can answer that question.
So I saw one of the factors for stomach cancer you listed was the Epstein-Barr virus, and you said that is like a new finding.
Yes.
What's that mechanism exactly?
So that was actually it was new finding was when gastric cancer was sequenced in part of the Human Cancer Genome Atlas, TCGA. When NCI did that effort, they found that EBV was associated with gastric cancer as a new infectious agent. Before that, we didn't know actually EBV can cause gastric cancer. So now EBV and H. pylori by itself, like over 90% of gastric cancers are due to EBV or H. pylori. But EBV is probably easier one to to develop a vaccine. So because I think the efforts are pretty strong, it looks like actually NCI have some candidate vaccine that could be available. That EBV is the same virus that causes mononucleosis.
So should people, like, for example, my husband has gastric cancer. Should our family be tested to see if we have Epstein-Barr or H. pylori? I mean, and does that affect treatment? You know, whether you have that or not.
I'm not aware of any impact on treatment for that. It's more, I'm not sure what is, if EBV positive would be treated differently. That probably would be a question for Dr. Marshall or Dr. Hyun.
But so you're saying families of the gastric patients, should we get tested for those things or not? Like to see if we've had Epstein-Barr at some point or if the H. pylori is in our system.
So I think EBV test is pretty easy. It's available to do. So that's not, I think the doctors are doing that anyway.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't have a test if you didn't have symptoms, right?
Right.
For Epstein-Barr.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Okay. Just curious. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Umar. And finally, I'd like to call back up Dr. Marty Taylor, who gave us his presentation in the afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Hi, everybody. Long time no see. I guess I can, does this thing still work? I don't know if I can. Okay, I'll try it this way this time. So, so we already did this disclosures part. So I'm going to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into this transposable elements dark genome stuff that we do in the lab. I'm going to talk about transposable elements in the dark genome. I'll tell you why it's called the dark genome. What is it? Why should you care? And this is really all future application. So none of this is quite yet at the clinic, but I'll go through just a little bit about what we're excited about here and a little bit of genomics and some things that you might not think about normally. So human transposons and the dark genome, it's named after dark matter. And it was called actually junk DNA by the famous biologist Sidney Brenner, recently passed. And it actually got kind of put in the corner because of that and largely marginalized because this huge portion of the genome was just some junk, whatever. And Brenner eventually recanted as more and more people showed that there was something here. And he eventually said that, I called it junk DNA, okay, not trash DNA. You put the junk in your attic and you take it back out when you need it, the trash you throw out. Anyway, you know, the sort of joking and the history aside, between half and 2/3 of our genome are actually these same few sequences repeated over and over again with very little differences, whereas only about 2% of the genome are genes. So these DNA sequences that get mutated in cancer that we're very interested in and otherwise actually are a much, much smaller portion of the genome and a really small portion. And so this big piece of the pie So the protein coding genes is that little gray bit in the bottom. And all of a bunch of the big gray part on the left is actually also probably derived from these repeated sequences, but has changed so much over evolution that it's a little hard to recognize. And of these transposons, these mobile elements, these are virus-like sequences that can be understood in two classes. It's really quite simple. If you've used a computer and a word processor, you should get this. The first one is called cut and paste, and the second is copy and paste. And all the sequences want to do is make a new copy in a new place in the genome. Cut and paste, or DNA transposons, these were how transposons were originally developed. Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize for this, because this is how corn, if you've ever seen those corn ears with all the different color kernels, that's how that works. It's also how our immune system makes antibodies and T cell receptors that are really, really specific and potent. But the actual transposons that are trying to cut and paste themselves in the genome are no longer active in the human genome. They're still in fish, they're in bacteria, but there aren't any in humans. In contrast, humans have two classes of copy and paste transposons. One is called endogenous retroviruses and one is called Line1. And both of them use an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, which is the same key enzyme that's active in HIV. Now, endogenous retroviruses look almost exactly like HIV. And shockingly, this is a huge portion of our genome. About 10% of the genome, 8% of the genome are these essentially dead copies of these endogenous retroviruses that are no longer active. And they went dead around when we were in a primate lineage about 15 million years ago. And so we call them dead in humans, although all of the pieces of the program are in the human genome, they're just not all in one place. So in cancer, actually, sometimes some of those pieces get turned on, and that's a thing that people are interested in and I'm interested in, but it's not most of what I'm going to talk about. The piece that I'm going to talk about is Line1, which is active and it's still moving in the human germline, and there's 100 active copies potentially in every one of our cells. So I'll go through this a little bit. So pardon the molecular biology diagram, but hopefully I can walk you through this and this will make some sense. So 500,000 copies and fragments of Line1 has written about a third of the genome, and that itself is about 15 or 20% of the genome. And we've been evolving with these virus-like sequences since we were single-celled organisms for about 2 billion years, maybe even longer. And so it's a really complicated relationship over this long. We fight them, and they have ways around the defenses. So in normal healthy tissue, they sit in the germline, and our bodies keep them silent. But in certain disease states, including cancer, they break free. And the biomarker that I showed before is derived from Line1 called ORF1. So why should you care about it? Well, it's pervasively expressed in cancer. It appears that it could be a useful biomarker. And the enzymatic activities, this reverse transcriptase activity, we think is a key part of cancer genesis. And sorry, my fonts, something happened to my fonts. Anyway, we knew very little about how these work, and we're starting to be able to crack into it. And that's allowing us to make new kinds of therapies. So the way this works, the copy and paste, is that the copy just sits in the germline and it makes an RNA copy. This is how genes are made too. And the RNA goes out into the cytoplasm where, like a virus, instead of just making its proteins that go do its business, the Line1 proteins, like a virus, bind back to the same sequence that made it. And what it wants to do is take that back into the nucleus, where the ORF2 protein, the business end of the transposon, is going to copy and paste a new version of it in a new place of the genome. If that seems bad, it's because it is. That's causing a mutation in a new place in the genome. Our cells really don't like this, and this is the outcome they're trying to fight. So two things can happen. First, the transposon can win, and it makes a new copy in a new place. And if that lands someplace important, we have a problem. And about 2% of colon cancers and a little bit less in other cancers are initiated in this manner. Now, this seems to actually be the vast minority of outcomes. And what seems to happen most of the time is that the cell is able to fight this and something else happens. Sometimes we win and we go back to where we started. But if the process gets started, it can scramble the genome and it can cause rearrangements and lots of damage. And we've also started to understand that the virus-like elements can do something we didn't expect, which is that they can misfire too soon in the cytoplasm, and they can make double-stranded nucleic acids in the cytoplasm, which then the cells think they're infected with a virus, or maybe it's a conserved response between the virus and the transposons, and that we think causes inflammation. So we've animated this. So I'll walk through it. The human genome contains approximately 500,000 copies. a detailed high resolution understanding of the transposon, we may be able to develop new effect cancer prevention. That's the very expensive animation that we generated with a really fabulous company called Visual Science, who helps us kind of share the message. So I hope I've explained this sort of very esoteric and previously weird, and people thought, why are you working on this kind of part of biology? But now I'm going to tell you just a little bit about why we think this is actually interesting and where we're going with this. So going back to the 1990s, it had been known since Bert Vogelstein's lab at Hopkins found a line 1 that had landed in a tumor suppressor gene causing a colon cancer that this might be involved in cancer biology. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that we made these antibodies that we could use to stain the line 1 proteins in cancer that we realized that this wasn't just a rare thing that was happening. We were shocked that in most cancer types, the majority of cases were positive. And in the intervening years, as we've repeated the studies, as we've gotten better at the immunostaining, as other groups have done this, we've learned that this is a really pervasive part of epithelial cancer biology, carcinoma biology, especially gastroesophageal cancers, where in the recent paper, 52 out of 52 cases we stained were positive. So, and as I mentioned, as I showed earlier today, the normals are not positive. So this is a binary thing that's on in the cancer and not in the normal. And that creates some really interesting and unique opportunities. So the first one is that we might be able to make a better diagnosis. And so you guys probably in this room, Barrett's esophagus needs no introduction, and intestinal metaplasia needs no introduction. But I'll just say for any who don't know that this is a high-risk precursor. Well, it's a precursor anyway that is increased risk. And depending on the kind of Barrett's, you go from non-dysplastic Barrett's, which with obesity could be in as much as 5 or 6 or 10% of the US population, to precursors of cancer called dysplasia that are much higher risk, especially high-grade dysplasia. The problem is that the food and the reflux and the Barrett's are all in the same place. And inflammation and cancer can look very similar on the microscope, making it hard for pathologists to make a diagnosis. Sampling is also very challenging for the endoscopist. So we're not great at managing this clinically. And what we would really like to be able to do is to prevent esophageal cancer by finding people with Barrett's who are at higher risk earlier and doing the correct interventions. So we just tested them on the tissue level for the protein. And what we found was that the high-risk precursors, high-grade dysplasias, were pretty ubiquitously positive, as were the cancers. And then what was interesting is the patients where pathologists couldn't agree, that we call indefinite, 5 of the 9 ended up positive for either the protein or the RNA marker that we had, and all 5 of them went on to later have the high-risk, high-grade dysplasia in a subsequent biopsy. So what we think this means is that this is a marker of high risk, and that if you're positive for this, that the lesion, at least for this level of expression that we can detect here, is something that needs to be treated with higher risk. So we need to do more work to understand this. And as I showed before, we can actually see this in the stomach as well, in precursors of both the diffuse and the solid type. And we think that this means that line 1 expression is on in carcinogenesis, and there's other data in the colon that support this idea as well. So these cancers are evolving in the presence of line 1, whereas the normal tissue doesn't have it. And actually, one of the reasons that I'm still working on this, and that a number of labs are still working on this, is that we observed that if you put this on in tissue culture cells, some of which are derived from cancers, the cells stop growing and die. They really, really don't like it. But these cancers are evolving in the presence of this. So how does that work? How are these cancers tolerating this, and what is it doing to the cancer? I'll get into that more in a moment. So some of this science and understanding how these proteins work, we've been able to detect in one. This is all the one protein, the one that the shadow looks like. It's a really fancy thing that I won't go into in detail. We were able to model of what, and with some really technology, going into detail, we were able to trace think it gets into the blood in a similar way that the circulating tumor DNA does. So we were able to take these assays and show potential clinical utility. And I showed this earlier that we can see a patient responding or not responding throughout a clinical trial intervention, a therapeutic intervention. So I talked about this earlier, so I won't go through this now, but I'll just point out that it was true in both gastroesophageal cancer and colon cancer in our patient population, whereas this identified a higher risk group if you were high for this marker. But the other piece that I wanted to talk about now in the context of prevention and early detection is what it looks like in healthy people. So I didn't have time to talk about this before, but we ran 400 healthy controls from our biobank. And of those patients, 1 was very positive, and 3 were intermediate, and then the other 390 or 402 or something like that are sitting all on that flat line at the bottom where we couldn't detect the protein at all. Now, that guy at the top up there thought he was healthy when he donated his blood to the biobank, and 6 months later is found to have an advanced prostate cancer that it's up his back and in his bones. Some of you know what that's like. It's awful, as I understand it. I hope I never find out. So this got us really excited because this is the point, right? Is that we might be able to run these tests on people and find somebody who's sitting there at home with an advanced cancer or an intermediate cancer that we could do something about. And now those other 3 dots, I'm worried about them. We don't know what's happened with them in between, but we're worried. And the reason I'm worried is that across about 1,000 cancer patients with different diseases, with this first generation assay that we developed, and this is all published on Cancer Discovery now, we had between 20 and 30 and up to 70% detection of this protein in their blood. And we knew that in the tissue, when we had the tissue from the patient, that actually we could detect between 90 and 100% of many of these cancers. So we thought we could do better. So we went back to work and we made a better test by combining different capture and detection reagents in that assay in different ways. And we spent a lot of time on this, and I won't go into the details, but we did a lot of engineering together with a really talented group in David Walt's lab and Kathy Burns' lab, a really fabulous person named Connie Wu, who now has her own lab at Michigan. We developed a series of these tests, and what we were able to do with an ovarian cancer cohort, where the first generation assay that I just showed you, in a group we got from Rowney Drapkin at Penn, detected about 50 or 60% of the patients. We were able to increase the sensitivity to pick up most of the patients, or nearly all of the patients, including some stage 1 patients that were in the cohort. We're able to get to 5 of the 6 with a test that detected very few of the healthy controls. And this one, we added it in a multi-analyte panel with other markers for ovarian cancer, and basically a very baby MSED test, like we were talking about earlier, was able to shift the area under the curve up and help us discriminate better cancer from normal. Now, this is just proof of concept, but we're excited about the potential of this to be added with a Guardant test, to be added with other methylation tests. There's many other really exciting tests in this space. So we're hopeful that this will turn into something, and we're working on it. We're also able to do better in gastric cancer. So Dr. Klempner at Mass General had a really nice cohort of patients, and we took 10 patients where we couldn't detect them in our early assays using our first platform, and we ran them on a separate platform that had just been developed in the Walt lab that is even more sensitive still, and we're able to detect 9 of the 10 that we were missing. We've also been able to keep doing the engineering since it worked the first time and push the concepts and detect more of the gastric cancer patients that we had missed in the early tests in the old platform. So we're excited that we think we can keep making these tests better, but at some point we also just have to start rolling them out. So we're trying to do both of those things. So that's the biomarker story. So we're interested in that for a couple of applications. The last thing I want to just talk about is this carcinogenesis story. And this is a slightly simpler version of the slide that you just had up before, Dr. Umar, that basically this is often called the Vogelgram after Bert Vogelstein, who drew the first one up in colon cancer. The exact same pathway isn't true in gastric cancer most of the time, but the same principle applies, which is that as you go from normal to cancer, there's a series of alterations that happen genetically, some of which we understand, many of which we don't. And the key mutations that we look for in the sequencing assays define the different stages of polyp in the colon. So as you get more and more mutations, you get a bigger, worse polyp, and eventually you get an invasive cancer. This pathway is called the chromosomal instability pathway in the colon, but what's really interesting is that the source of the chromosomal instability is unknown. And if you make all of these mutations in the lab in colon cancer-like cells, you can make things that look like the patient lesions in how they behave for metastasis. They're not chromosomally unstable. So we have a lot of data that suggests that line 1 might be doing some of this chromosomal instability by getting into the genome and mucking it up, as I was mentioning before. So we're working on testing that going forward. But we think it could be a target for chemoprevention because if we're right, we could do a trial and there's drugs that we can use. So what are we thinking about? So this trial was published in Cancer Discovery last year. So the HIV reverse transcriptase inhibitors that Dr. Marshall mentioned earlier, HIV in line 1 looks similar enough that many of those drugs are actually quite effective against line 1. And David Ting at Mass General, my colleague and mentor, said, look, if we could just give these patients this drug that's safe, they've failed all of their other options for colon cancer, maybe we can slow it down. And the trial failed its primary endpoint, but you can see from the waterfall plot there that all of those patients in blue had stable disease for some time. And a couple of the patients had biochemical responses that we could measure by reduction in markers like CEA in the blood. So this is published. We don't understand who it worked for, why it worked exactly. And we're more interested in general in the genesis than the advanced cancer. But this is a safe drug that can be used in established disease. And I was just having a conversation with somebody earlier about maybe we could think about compassionate use of some of these drugs in people who actually have advanced cancer because they're so safe. So, wow, that font really does make it hard to see what I tried to say there. But this is some biochemistry that we've done in the corner. These are inhibition curves. Basically, the point is that we've taken and we've published this now. Basically, all of the existing HIV reverse transcriptase inhibitors, and essentially all of them inhibit line 1 to some extent or another. And the ones that are used for PrEP, for example, like Truvada, are incredibly safe and are actually in combination quite effective against line 1. And interestingly, epidemiologically, if you can find HIV patients who are stable, where their HIV is not progressing to the point that they're immunosuppressed, it appears in a number of studies that they have a really marked reduced risk of cancer. So we're very interested, and I was supposed to have dinner tonight with somebody at the NCI named Dr. Castle, who we've been collaborating with to try to do a trial in chemo prevention. Unfortunately, Dr. Castle's sick tonight, so I get to hang out here with you guys a little longer, which is awesome. But I'm really excited that we might be able to get a trial off the ground at the NCI to see if we can prevent cancer in high-risk patients by using these drugs. So that's really, the last thing I was going to say is that we've got some this binary nature where line 1 is on in cancer and not in normal. I've talked about detecting it. I haven't talked about killing the cancer. So we don't think that usually the reverse transcriptase inhibitor will kill the cancer, but they might help slow down some things the transposon is doing. What I want to develop in my lab, and one of the things that we're just starting to work on now, is can we develop a new strategy to use the fact that this is in cancer cells and not in normal to kill the cancer? If we could, it might make a new universal cancer therapy. Of course, it's all pie in the sky until something works. But we're thinking about this day and night. We have 2 projects going to make a new kind of vaccine and also to make a new kind of small molecule. And I'm really excited to try them in mice first. And if they work in mice, then I guess I'll get to talk to the FDA and everybody else and companies about trying to turn them into a real drug. So that would be the dream. My hope is that through this kind of basic science, we can learn things that are important in cancer, and we can develop new treatments and new tests that will make people's lives better and may prevent people from developing cancer in the first place. So that's the pitch. So I'm really excited about the advocacy you guys are doing tomorrow. We need more funding. We've done most of this on a shoestring where we borrow from Peter to pay Paul to do the science we want to do, or we do it in our spare time because we have a lot of that. And so, you know, I'm really, really just deeply happy that you guys are doing this and move that you guys are really making a push to get more money for this kind of work. We try to use whatever money we can get the best we can. And we are also trying to advocate for more. So thanks very much, everyone.
What kind of funding do we ask for that you would be using?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is I'm trying to apply through foundations, you know, for this kind of work to specific gastric cancer underlying biology. There's 2 sources essentially, right? One is an NIH R01 type grant, where you essentially convince another group of scientists that this is really exciting and innovative and great. And as we heard earlier, the pay lines for those are around 10%. So you have to have a really good grant. So we're trying to start doing that now. We have tried in the past and it's not been generally successful because it was unproven, because it was new. The other major source is foundations, where people who, for example, the De Gregorio Foundation and others often support this kind of really innovative work. The Kless Foundation has supported some of the work we've done. Stand Up to Cancer has supported some of the work we've done. But so as far as advocacy, I think the 2 places are, you know, it's hard to advocate to increase the NIH budget, but the moonshot may be a source where we can get it. I mean, I would love it if the NIH budget would be like what the director said earlier today, was going up in the way that they were asking. That would be enormous for us. I can't tell you how many people I know who have quit doing this kind of work because they can't get grants. And they're tired of writing the same great grant over and over again and not getting it funded. So it's a really difficult situation. So the advocacy is amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Two questions in relation to the ORF1 protein.
Yeah.
First, does it need to be phosphorylated to be active? And second, you did show a pictorial depiction of its structure.
Yeah.
Does it look like it's druggable?
Well, we're trying to drug it. It's not druggable in the conventional way, but we're trying to use some new techniques to do it. Our own mass spec data showed it was phosphorylated going back 10 years, and there is a paper that's saying that phosphorylation is important for its activity. I'm not sure that that really matters that much in this case. It may or it may not. A lot of the residues that are phosphorylated in humans are not that conserved, and the ORF1 protein from a whale can complement the one from a human. But those PTMs may or may not matter. What we think matters more is that the ORF1 protein likely hides the transposon from the cell in a particular way. And we think we could break that. We also think that if we could drag it, like turn it into a degrader, if you're familiar with those ideas, that we could make a degrader that would just destroy the whole thing.
I think Dana-Farber has an actual center for protein degradation that's working precisely on that.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of people who are really good at making PROTACs and all of these different, there's about, I think every month there's a new strategy to use it now that we know that it works. So the first step for that is making a binder. And so we have some, and we're making proof of concept degraders actually in the lab right now. So we're excited about it.
Thank you.
Do we know a physiological activity for line 1 besides just, keeping transposons around?
Yeah.
And then other question, do you think that it's maybe more likely that it's more like a harbinger of chromosomal instability as opposed to has any, anything more than a side effect role?
Yeah, these are great questions, and they're both controversial. The first question is, why do we still have this, right? Why do we still have this thing? The simplest explanation is it's just a good enough parasite that it's copying a little faster than we can get rid of it. And actually, some organisms have killed it. The megabat, those big giant bats that hang from trees, they don't have any more active line elements. They won. We killed HERV-K, right? The endogenous retroviruses are dead. So that's the simplest explanation. And now there were some papers that suggested that line 1 was important in the brain, in development, that new insertions happen at some rate and they create some mosaicism. The normalizations were all wrong. And actually, one of my colleagues at Rochester has a mouse that has a genetic system to knock down the line 1 elements. They just have longer health span. They live on average 30% longer. They're neurologically intact. There's nothing apparently wrong with them. So, and the mice have been evolved for a very short amount of time, and they actually have 3,000 lines that are active, whereas we have 100. So the argument is that this is a thing that is essentially causing problems after we've reproduced. And so we've essentially not selected it out. Right? It's just a weak enough problem that it doesn't kill people, but enough of a problem that now we're not living in cave people anymore, right? We live a lot longer and it's becoming a problem. So that's the first point. The second point was not, does it do something, but is it a canary in the coal mine, basically, right?
Yeah. Only a canary in the coal mine, basically.
Yeah. So I love this argument, which is that we've kept it around because it gets turned on when the epigenome gets messed up. Right? Because the epigenomic state is what keeps it down. And so it's a sensor of that. It's a really cool idea. It's hard to test it exactly, but we're interested to do so. The argument that we have is that it gets turned on with epigenetic dysregulation, and probably most of the time between the fact that cells really don't like it and they go into what's called a p53 mediated arrest, and the inflammation that they induce together basically cause that stem cell to stop dividing, and it probably gets pushed out of the epithelium. The problem is 1 in a million times, it doesn't. And when that happens, you've got a real problem because it can help select for a p53 mutation, we think, and now it's going to be pro-inflammatory and change the whole tumor microenvironment. I think I've gone way over time. Should we take one more?
Quick, silly question, perhaps.
No silly questions.
So what happens when you have a hiatal hernia in Barrett's? Does it all look the same in the hiatal hernia?
So when they send it to me, because it's been taken out of the patient with an endoscope, it looks very similar to me. The endoscopist doesn't think it looks the same. And hiatal hernia is a treatable high-risk condition that causes reflux and increases risk of cancer. But the carcinogenesis process is essentially the same. in a hiatal hernia, Barrett's versus reflux Barrett's. And actually, there's ligation models in the rat where you can basically like tie a suture around a part of the bowel or the stomach and cause bile to reflux. And when you do that, you can create esophageal cancer that looks a little bit like human. So the thought is that obesity and reflux together are a high-risk situation, along with H. pylori that we just heard about. Both are now modifiable with drugs, right? Obesity was really, really hard to treat, and now we're in this crazy time where people can get skinny with medication. So that's been really exciting from my perspective. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for both your presentations and for spending your day with us. This now concludes our live streaming portion of the meeting. For those of us who joined us, we hope you found the summit informative and powerful. And those of you on the live stream, we will not have dinner for you. I'm sorry about that. We do have dinner for the people who are here in person. It's out there. And after dinner, we'll be back here for our final program tonight, where we'll be talking about the agenda tomorrow and Advocacy. Yes, the live stream's over. All right. All right.